All right. One more thing here. Okay, well, we're going to learn about this is going through the last chapter of Genesis for this session, Genesis 11, and it's mainly about the Tower of Babel, but an introduction to Abraham Abraham, as we'll see. So in the previous lesson, which was last week, if you weren't here, then I guess nobody on here was here. We discovered that something even as mundane as a genealogy can really reveal some interesting insights about the Bible and God's omnipotence and his plan to save all the nations. One of the characters we studied last week was Nimrod. Now, just to give a quick review, because I think we probably need it with the audience. We'd been studying Noah. Noah got off the ark. Noah had a family. He had 3 sons: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem was sort of the good son. Ham was the bad one, and Japheth was the somewhere in between. So Noah blessed Shem, he cursed Ham, and he had said that Japheth's okay, but he would be needing Shem's help, essentially, just to boil it down to that. One of the descendants of Ham, the bad son, was Nimrod. We learned about, and he was known for his hunting ability, and which we said really, if you look at it, it was more like he was a ruthless Putin more than a hunter, and or just a mean person. So nevertheless, we found last week God has a plan, and no Nimrod's going to stand in the way of that plan. No anybody's going to. This week we're going to move to learn more about this guy Nimrod, then the Tower of Babel, and then we're going to trace the line of Noah's line from Shem, the good son, all the way to Abram. Now let's start out with a proverb. There are many plans in a man's heart, but it is the Lord's plan that will stand. That's Proverb 19:21. And in fact, few chapters in the Bible illustrate this proverb better than Genesis 11. Because when we read this history of Babel and then read the genealogies that follow, it just overflows with how God is at work in his world and is accomplishing his purposes. No matter what we throw at him, in spite of any of the plans and projects of us, his sinful people, his plans proceed because he is all powerful. So let's begin. The first here, we're going to learn about a revolt and how God deals with it. So let's look at Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9. We have that. At that time, all the people of the world spoke the same language and used the same words. As the people migrated to the east, they found a plain in the land of Babylonia and settled there. Well, that's Mesopotamia. They began saying to each other, "Let's make bricks and harden them with fire." because in this region, bricks were used instead of stone and tar was used for mortar. Then they said, come,
Am I going to go to the bathroom?
come, let's build a great city for ourselves with a tower that reaches to the sky. This will make us famous and keep us from being scattered all over the world. But the Lord came down to look at the city and the tower the people were building. Look, he said, the people are united and they all speak the same language. After this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages. See a little bit of the Trinity there. Then they won't be able to understand each other. In that way, the Lord just spoke the word, spoke and said, we need to do this. And instantly, the Lord scattered them all over the world and they stopped building that city. That is why the city was called Babel, because it's where the Lord confused people with different languages. And in this way, he scattered them all over the world. We'll learn more about what Babel means here in a minute. Or Babel, let's call it Babel. Yeah. So what happened here? Well, the Tower of Babel is one of the 4 great events recorded in Genesis 1 through 11. Can you think of some of the other great events in Genesis 1 that we've come across so far? Great events in Genesis.
Of course, Noah and the flood.
Noah and the flood, yeah.
The events in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. So the fall, yeah. And then
creation.
Okay. And then now we have the Tower of Babel. So creation, the fall, Noah, and the Tower of Babel. And if so far we have mankind continuing to disobey God. Yet he's judged our sin, and through his grace, he's made a new beginning each time. Throughout, he's been in control. When Adam and Eve sinned, he clothed them and made a covenant that he would send a redeemer. And that was the fall. And when Cain killed Abel, God sent Seth, another brother, so that Adam and Eve would have a son who would be a good son. And then when Seth's descendants intermarried with Cain's descendants, it polluted everything. And God just, that's when he sent the flood to fix that. Destroyed everybody except for faithful Noah. And then in this lesson, the Tower of Babel, we find again sin entering in as Noah's descendants, especially the descendants of Ham, commit what has to be one of the most arrogant things that recorded anywhere in the scripture, just to try to become like God. We'll see. So let's look at this rebellion in more detail. What happened? So the people all moved east to the land of Shinar. Okay, that's what we learned. Now, in the previous lesson, we learned that Shinar was where Nimrod, who was a Hamite, like I mentioned, a descendant of Ham, built great cities. He built Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. But wait a minute. Why was Nimrod in Shinar, which is, like I said, Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, when we learned also last week that that's where the Shemites settled, the descendants of the good son Shem. So why was Nimrod over there? Why wasn't, the Hamites are supposed to be over in the land of Canaan and in Africa, according to last week's lesson. Well, how could that be? Well, the answer is because last week's lesson actually skipped over the spreading out of the people from the Tower of Babel, and that disbursement of his descendants in chapter 10 had not yet occurred at this point in chapter 11 when Nimrod was building these empires. At this point, the people had not dispersed, they were all together. And that's not what God said to do, though. If you recall, way back when he was talking to Adam at the beginning, he said he commanded mankind to be fruitful and multiply and scatter across the earth. But instead, they remained clumped together, moved as kind of a group, and they moved to Nimrod's city of Babylon and settled there. So that was a blatant rebellion against God, because he wanted them to spread out, but they didn't. They stayed together. Probably Nimrod, you could view him as a Putin, this dictator who wanted them in his cities and under his control. You know, he was a dictator. He wanted to be in control of everybody. And so you can just imagine that maybe it was maybe not everybody moved under their own control, but it was maybe a military might was involved in this too. We don't know, but that seems very feasible to me. So what'd they do? Nimrod had this big, huge population of people. He set them to work building this tower that they built at Babel, and that tower is known as a ziggurat. Archaeologists have excavated several of these structures, and they were primarily for religious purposes. It's like a pyramid. I put a picture of it in the lesson today, except that if you don't know what one looks like, you can look there, but it's like a pyramid, except it's got these levels along the way. And what that allows you to do is build a staircase to go all the way to the top. And, you know, I've heard most of the commentaries or ministers or preachers I've heard talk about Tower of Babel. They say that it was an attempt for man to reach heaven and be either equivalent to God or dethrone him. Now, Wiersbe thinks that and others think that in building this structure, they weren't trying to climb up to heaven to dethrone God. They were trying to get, they hoped that their God or goddesses, you know, would come down and meet them halfway at the top of this ziggurat. And that way they would be equals with their gods. So, you know, it's an example where they were trying to be equal to God. That's a very arrogant thing to do. At this point, you know, you have Babylon, or Babel was the name of the city, but they also called this structure the Babel. And what Babel really means is not what we read in the Bible. It doesn't mean confusion. It means the gate of the gods. So God put an end to it, right? Because it's like a revolt. They're trying to climb up and be equivalent to God. What were they doing wrong? Well, to begin with, they were resisting God's request, or it was command, to spread out and repopulate the world. They were motivated probably by fear, but also by pride when they built this ziggurat and decided to build this city too, and stay together. You know, they wanted to make a name for themselves, pride, arrogance, so that they could admire themselves. in effect, they were deceived by Satan, just like Eve was. You know, he told Eve in the Garden of Eden that you will be like God if you eat this fruit. Well, they wanted to be like God. They were ambitious and full of pride and not wanting to obey God. They wanted to obey themselves. So in Genesis 11:5-9, we hear God's response. Let me just go through that again. But the Lord came down to look at the city and the tower the people were building. Look, he said, the people are united. They all speak the same language. After this, nothing they do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages. Then they won't be able to understand each other. In that way, the Lord scattered them all over the world, and they stopped building that city. I mentioned that it says that's why the city was called Babel, because that's where the Lord confused the people with different languages. In this way, he scattered them all over the world. So God's response was, think about it. It says he came down to look at the city and figure out what they were doing. Well, God knew what they were doing, right? He knows everything, but he came down more for their benefit than for his. It's kind of just an expression that a way to describe what God was up to. And in the process, Babel's kind of conceited idea of let's go up to God was answered by heaven's calm. Well, let's go down. So they did get met halfway, but it didn't come out like they hoped. Because if we another psalm to consider is Psalm 2 verse 4. So we just read Psalm 2 verses 1-3. But this one says, but the one who rules in heaven laughs, the Lord scoffs at them. Of course, God didn't have to investigate to know what was going on in his universe. Right? He knew. Okay. Just like with Adam and Eve's banishment in the garden, God judged Babel, and in doing so, dealt not only with the immediate problem, but also prevented problems in the future. Because a united mankind would only give people a false sense of power, which isn't good for them. It would lead them into even greater rebellion against God. By confusing their language and scattering them all over the earth, it was a merciful thing to do, because the other alternative was just to wipe them out like he did with the flood. This time he spared their lives and gave them the opportunity to return to him. So, well, let's break this thing up and see what happens. And he decided this time to let them live. Okay, now the word Babel sounds like the Hebrew word Balel. And Balel means confusion. But God's judgment, because of God's judgment, you have him make this play on words. The gate of the gods, Babel, became the door to confusion. Okay, so instead of making a name for themselves, God gave their project a new name. So he pretty much changed the word Babel from gate of the gods to confusion. So Babel, now we think of somebody babbling, they're speaking nonsense, they're just confusion, babbling away. Now in his church, God's not a God of disorder. 1 Corinthians 14 tells us that things should be in order in God's church. But in the world, God sometimes uses disorder and confusion for our own good, to humble us and keep us from uniting against his will. Speaking of these words that get changed a little bit, as we learned previously, the word Shem, now Shem was the good son, means name in Hebrew. And God promised Shem's descendant Abraham in the next chapter, just a few verses over in Genesis 12:2, he promised Abraham that he will make his name great among the nations. We look at Genesis 12:2. Yeah, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. So Shem means name, and Shem's descendant Abraham became a great name. Worldly people under the sun, depend on their own wisdom and efforts to make a name for themselves. But it really doesn't last very long. For example, okay, all these pumped up, arrogant people building that Tower of Babel, how many do we know any of their names? We don't know any of their names. Yet the name of Abraham is known around the world by Jews and Christians and Muslims. So there's a big, huge difference between mankind's idea that we will make our name great, we will make our name great, and God's, I will make your name great. So the we will make our name great were the builders of the Tower of Babel. I will make your name great is Abraham. And in today's world, it seems like this we will make our name great just dominates to me. It's just everywhere. And there we lack, I think, a level of humbleness, being humble and well, anyway, I think y'all know what I'm talking about. In the book of Genesis, like I said, especially in Genesis, a name is very important. What you name somebody or something kind of identifies that person. So when God changes the name, it is a big deal. He changes Abram's name to Abraham, Sarai's name to Sarah, Esau becomes Edom or Red, Jacob becomes Israel, and so forth. What God calls a thing is far more important than what we call it. And the word Babel would convey gates of the God. Who thinks of Babel as meaning gates of the God today? We think of it as confusion, somebody babbling. So that's what God did. He came down in a figurative way. He said, he spoke the word, and all of a sudden, the people were speaking different languages, and they were spread all over in the places that we studied last week. So now, after the spreading, the people in the land of Babylon or Mesopotamia or Shinar, they were all the sons of Shem, the good son, and the Hamites that were now displaced to Canaan and Egypt. And then the Japheth, the third son, they were spread way up into Europe and Asia, as we learned last week. So that's what God did. Okay, we just to back up a minute and see where we are. Okay, the people rebelled by not spreading out and by building the ziggurats to try to become like God. God responded by spreading them out and confusing their language. Okay, now what's our our reply to that. It's the story of Babel isn't just part of ancient history. It actually, you can see that it represents a spiritual challenge to every believer today. It's still there. Babylon eventually became a great city and a great empire. From 606 to 586 BC, the Babylonian armies attacked and just persecuted the kingdom of Judah, eventually burning the temple and the city and destroying it, and took the Jews captives. We have the whole captivity period for 70 years. And every time I think of that captivity, I think of this Psalm 137. Beside the rivers of Babylon, there's verse, I'm sorry, 137 verses 1 through 4. Beside the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept as we thought of Jerusalem. We put away our harps, hanging them on the branches of poplar trees. For our captors demanded a song from us. Our tormentors insisted on a joyful hymn. Sing us one of those songs of Jerusalem. But how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a pagan land? It's such a sad time for the peoples. Why were they there? Because they continued to disobey God, continued. Finally, he said, I got to correct them. I got to show them that they need to change. So how did he do it? Well, he used these cruel, sinful Babylonians to correct his disobedient people. Throughout the scripture, Babylon is a metaphor for worldly pride and defiance against God. You see it in a lot of the prophetic writings, and you see it in Revelation. It contrasts. You have the earthly city Babylon is the contrast against the heavenly city of Jerusalem. You see that interplay a lot in the Bible, because in Babylon rebelled against God, but the heavenly city of Jerusalem brings glory to him. Babylon represents a world system that opposes the Lord, hates Jesus Christ, and appeals to the kind of baser appetites of human nature. It's the opposite of Jerusalem, which is the city of the saints. In Babel, people wanted to build a tower to reach to the heavens, but in Babylon, in the Babylon of the book of Revelation, it is Babylon's sin that reaches up to heaven. Not the people, but their sin is what makes its way up. In Revelation 18:5, get a taste of that. For her sins, that is this woman who represents Babylon, for her sins are piled as high as heaven, and God remembers her evil deeds. So her sins are piled up to heaven. So you got this ziggurat effectively in Revelation. I never made that connection with this verse and Tower of Babel, but you have the person who represents Babylon, their sins are piled up like this ziggurat that do reach to heaven. There's so many. Yeah, Revelation, it prophesies to us that the worldwide unity, that Nimrod desired, one day it's going to be achieved by Satan's godless world system. Remember, in the end, the Antichrist pulls everybody together. So it comes back together. Earthly, in Revelation, earthly Babylon is called a prostitute, while the holy city, Jerusalem, from heaven is called the bride of Christ. Yet, Every generation continues to build its own towers to make a name for itself. We do it today. Some of our skyscrapers are there just so people can make a name for themselves. Our modern day ziggurats. But in many, many dimensions, the building up an empire, building up, pride, doing things to show yourself off. The football player who crosses the goal line and makes the, I'm number one kind of look. Yeah. Yeah. So that's what they encourage us to do. We can't escape being in the world because that's what Jesus calls us. That's where Jesus wants us to have our ministry, but we must avoid being in the world. We can't be coerced by the world to be like it. Don't be of the world. Just be in there, but not of it. We're here to build Jesus' church, not man's towers. I like that quote from Wiersbe. This unity that humanity failed to achieve by building its own towers, its own huge, tall towers, doesn't work. Christ has achieved that unity by dying on a humiliating little tower called the cross. While the world system is outwardly producing uniformity, inwardly, it's tearing things apart by controlling people's lives and just making a mess of things. So it might look like the world's kind of pulling everybody together and producing one big world. It's not happening on the inside. It's tearing apart people's lives. On the other hand, the Holy Spirit is using the church as an instrument to bring people together in Jesus Christ. How is it doing that? And this is another concept I had not thought of back to the Tower of Babel, but Pentecost was a reversal of Babel, because in Babel, the people were dispersed and given all different languages so they couldn't communicate. At Pentecost, the people present in Jerusalem from all these different countries and languages, speaking all these different languages, could all understand what Peter and the others who had been touched by the Holy Spirit with the tongues of fire were saying. So that was a way to reunite all the peoples. And the day is coming when people from every tribe and nation will worship Jesus, will worship the Christ. We see that in Revelation 15:4. Where it says, "Who will not fear you, Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous deeds have been revealed." So one day, all the nations will come together and will be united in our worship of Jesus. And the judgment of Babel will be done away with. We look at Zechariah 3:9. What does that mean? Then I will purify the speech of all people so that everyone can worship the Lord together. In other words, the confounding of the languages will be undone, and so that we can all speak with one tongue to praise God. So a takeaway from this part is that as it relates to us today, we need to make a choice, each one of us. Will we identify with the Babylon that's so pervasive all around us today, or with Jerusalem? The Babylon is a worldly prostitute in Revelation, symbolized that way and other places. whereas Jerusalem is the heavenly bride. We want to be the heavenly bride, of course. Now, in this chapter, we move to a different, kind of a different topic altogether, which is one of those boring genealogies, but it gives the line of descent from Shem to Abram. Okay, it just jumps into this. As we were talking, it kind of leads in that way, and it says this is the account of Shem's family. But we had a little bit of account of Shem's family in the previous, but we'll see that it had a different focus. So it says 2 years after the great flood, when Shem was 100, he became the father of Arphaxad. After the birth of Arphaxad, Shem lived another 500 years and had other sons and daughters. When Arphaxad was 35, he became the father of Shelah. And then after that, he lived to 403 years. Okay, went from 500 down to 403. When Shelah was 30, he became the father of Eber. And then after that, Shelah lived 403 years. When Eber was 34, he became the father of Peleg. And after Peleg, Eber lived another 430 years. Peleg was 30, he became the father of Reu. And then after Reu, Peleg only lived 209 years. When Reu was 32, he became the father of Serug. And then Reu lived another 207 years. When Serug was 30, he became the father of Nahor. And then he lived 200 years. When Nahor was 29, he became the father of Terah. And after Terah, Nahor lived 119 years. And then Terah, when he was 70, he became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. So this is the genealogy. And God had made this covenant that he would send a redeemer back, the seed of the woman to strike the head of the serpent, if you remember back in Genesis 3:15, and that redeemer would defeat Satan and bring salvation, as Jesus did do. So Noah's prophecy back in last week, we learned about it in chapter 10, revealed that God would bless the world through the line of Shem. And so that's where the name Semites come from. So they were the ancestors of the Hebrew people, which we see in this genealogy. Okay. Shem was the ancestor of all the sons of Eber, and it's likely that the word Hebrew comes from the name Eber. So all of the Arab and Jews are all considered, the Hebrews, and Semites as well. Genesis, well, let's see. In Genesis last chapter, we had a genealogy of Shem, as I mentioned, and we have one now. Well, they're doing different things. The first genealogy in chapter 10 lists all 5 sons and five of Shem's sons and 5 of his grandsons. But then it focuses down on Arphaxad and the 3 sons he had, Shelah, Eber, and then so forth. It lists many of his descendants, and the point is that it talks about everybody except the I'm sorry, let's see, from the genealogy in chapter 11, the focus is on Peleg's side of the family, who is the son of Eber, whereas the previous one focused on Joktan's side. Okay, and it goes down that side of it. This one goes down Peleg's side and takes us through to Abraham, because Peleg was the ancestor of Abraham. So if you look at it, one other point to make out of this genealogy is that we had a genealogy back in chapter 5 that took us from Adam down to Noah. If you look at the ages of the people, they keep getting less and less and less, so that by the time Nahor died, he was only 148 years old, whereas Noah was 950. So you see that after the flood, people started living shorter lives. The important thing about this genealogy is that it records the faithfulness of God in watching over his people and fulfilling his promises. It is a link, it's a bridge. What to us is only kind of a boring list of names was God's bridge from Noah's prophecy about Shem to God's call of Abraham. God uses people to help accomplish his will on earth, even though we're very fragile and not always obedient. But God nevertheless builds his bridges and keeps his covenant promises. Now we go into a different area of this chapter, which is 27 through 32, the family of Terah. Now we're getting into the Abraham story, where we read that this is the account of Terah's family. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. I'm going to do something. I'm going to show a screen. On the screen, I'm going to show a family tree here, because I think it will help us to understand the big picture. Let's see, that is in there. All right. Let me share that. Supposed to be it. I'm not seeing the share button. It's over here. Bear with me just a second. Share screen, there it is. Okay. There we are. That. Okay. You should be seeing the family of Abraham. Anybody see it yet?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, very good. All right, so God is what he's doing here is starting a nation. It's Genesis 1 through 11. Really, as we talked about earlier, it records 4 key events: the creation, the fall, the flood, and the judgment of Babel. And then the rest of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, is a record of the lives of 4 key men: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And we're going to see Abraham in here. He was called Abram at the time, up at the top right there in this family tree. And in Genesis, this chapter of Genesis, 5 people stand out. Abram, are you seeing my mouse move? Maybe. Abram and his wife Sarai, Terah, Abraham's father, at the top of the tree, and then Nahor and Haran, who are Abram's brothers. it was God's purpose to call a man and his wife, and from them build his family. That's Abram and Sarai. From that family, he would build a nation. And from that nation, God would bless all the nations of the earth. From start to finish, this was a work of God's grace. For when God called Abram and Sarai, they belonged to a family that worshiped idols. So there they are, essentially in Babylon. It's Ur of the Chaldees, but it's in the Mesopotamian area. And God calls them out of that mess and says, I want you to become my nation. According to Stephen in Acts 7:2, our glorious God appeared to Abraham and called him to go to Canaan. So let's look at Acts 7:2 quickly. When Stephen's giving his big speech before they stone him, it says, this was Stephen's reply. Brothers and fathers, listen to me. Our glorious God appeared to our ancestor Abraham in Mesopotamia before he settled in Haran. Okay. So he appeared to Abraham in Mesopotamia. Abraham must have shared this amazing message with his family and told them that he and Sarah were leaving. They said, we're leaving, guys. God called us. He was supposed to take only Sarah and depart and leave the family behind. But everybody went with him except his brother Nahor, and of course his brother Haran, who had died. Early, and it's noteworthy that Nahor stayed. He didn't go with him. He didn't go. He stayed in this idolatrous area, Ur of the Chaldees, and so. What do you think? Did Nahor believe the message his brother gave him about God's glory? That God had called? Well, we all hope he did. We don't know whether he did or not. Well, at any rate, he and his wife Milcah and his son Nahor and his daughter Rachel show up later in the story in Genesis 22:20. And that's that wonderful story where Rachel agrees to go and be the wife of Isaac eventually. But it starts out where Abraham's talking about his brother and children, the brother's children. It appears that Abram's father, did believe. Apparently, if you look at Acts 7:2, Stephen says that Abraham knew about it in Mesopotamia before he went to Haran. That means that before Abraham's father Terah took off himself, Abraham surely told his father about it. And apparently Terah believed because he started the trip to Canaan with his family, but for some reason he stopped at Haran. He didn't make it all the way. So that was part of God's plan, because God chose Abram and Sarai to build his nation. It's interesting. He chose them even though they were childless, and Sarai appeared unable to have children. Now, Abram means exalted father, but he wasn't a father at all. He didn't have any children. So these two, Abraham and Sarai, were the least likely candidates to have a family and build a great nation. That's just how God is. He loves to prove us wrong and show his miracles. God's ways are not our ways. And by calling and blessing a barren couple, the Lord revealed the greatness of his power and glory. And in the end, Abram would be named Abraham by God, which means father of many nations. Not only is he going to be a father of a great nation, he's going to be a father of many. Note the contrast between man's ways at Babel and God's ways in calling Abraham and Sarai. You know, the world depends on a large number of powerful people in order to accomplish things. But God chose 2 weak people to start a nation. If we look at the Isaiah 55, 8 and 9, it's wonderful verses. It says, my thoughts are not like your thoughts, says the Lord, and my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. That's should instill the fear of the Lord in all of us. This that a reverence, a worshipfulness of such power, such might, yet such love and joy. In summary, the people at Babel wanted to make a name for themselves, but instead God promised to make Abram's name great. So these ziggurat builders in Babel followed the wisdom of this world, but Abram and Sarai trusted the word of God. Babel was built by the energy of the flesh and the motivation of pride, but the nation of Israel was built by the grace and power of God, and in spite of our human weaknesses. So we live in a confused world today. We live in a Babel today. Babel is still with us, but God still has his faithful remnant of followers who keep their eyes on the heavenly city, not on the worldly Babel, and we are part of that remnant. And let's close with these verses from Hebrews 11, 13 through 16. All these people died. That he's talking about the faithful that he brings about, that he just talked about, including Abraham and David and just all of these heroes of the Bible. It says all these people died still believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country that they can call their own. If they had longed for the country they came from, they could have gone back. But they were looking for a better place, not Babylon. They were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. That is why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Next week, we're going to finish this study of Genesis 1 through 11, the first part of Genesis, by reviewing these chapters 1 through 11 and identifying 12 fundamental truths upon which the rest of the Bible depends. Foundational truths that the rest of the Bible hinge on. So that will be chapter 13, the last chapter in Wiersbe, back to basics. Any comments, questions? Well, we're at the end of the hour. I did throw a question there from the Wearsby book, which is, how can we tell the difference between godly and selfish ambition? How do we know if what we're doing is for God or for ourselves? Any thoughts? Sharon or Larry or Janet? How do we know when what we're doing is for us and our ambition, or if it's for God?
Who are we trying to glorify? Is it ourselves or is it God?
I like that. Yeah. Who are we trying to glorify? And if it's not God, then we better rethink what we're doing.
Yes.
Seems so much of the world today is about glorifying ourselves.
That's true.
It's so encouraged. You look at commercials, you know, you deserve this car, or you, yeah. Who
Deserve the very best.
You deserve the very best.
It's for
Yeah.
one commercial.
Yeah, you deserve the very best. Yeah. And then you deserve a break today, even the McDonald's. And then we have you know, The Voice and America's Got Talent. You have these contests, see who's the best. But I think that's just us getting confused about wanting to glorify something, and we turn it into ourselves instead of God. Okay, anything else? Any other comments? All right, well, thank you. I'll go ahead and stop the sharing. Oh,
Recording.
any questions about this family tree of Abraham?
That's very, very interesting, very enlightening. I really like that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you have I like what, so the Ishmaelites, Ishmael had the Ishmael, from the Ishmaelites came the Arabs, in effect, came a whole religion. A Muslim religion claims Ishmael as their patriarch. And also in the Bible, you learn the Midianites were part of that, and they're the ones that the 11 brothers sold. Well, I guess it was 10 brothers because the little guy Benjamin wasn't part of it, but sold Joseph to those Midianite traders that came by. Esau became the Edomites, and then Jacob became the Israelites. And then over here at Lot, we have the first daughters, children became the Moabites, and then the Ammonites. And boy, do we see them a lot later in the battles that they have. They're always fighting, whether it's the Moabites or the Ammonites or the Edomites. It's just something that comes clear. Where these countries come from? Well, it's here in this family tree of Abraham. They're all descendants of him. Okay, well, let me stop that share, and we're back on the screen, and then I will go ahead and stop the recording.